that survey really helps me to figure out what to retouch on, how if we need to change the curriculum, right? We're always trying to make things better, and so thanks everyone for taking the time to fill out the survey. It's also a good chance just to take a pause and reflect on what you learned today. Hopefully you got a chance to walk through a lot of today's lab. I'm going to do a quick recap. I'll make this document available as well online, just like last time, so you guys can take a look at it. But let's just cover some high topics today and talk about some concepts, kind of reinforce these. So the first milestone, right, again, pretty easy, git clone. This time we didn't run Rails new. We kind of just cloned a repository, which is good. Make sure both of you can get access to the repository, git add, git commit, right, all the typical stuff. We ran this special code, right, Rails coder dating generate users, right, which is a little bit different. We haven't done that before. And a good question is, where is that file located and how is it defined? And we'll come back to that at the end, but it's a good thing to kind of think about. So the second milestone, git clone. You don't want to clone the Heroku URL because Heroku is not really a full Git repository. It's just to show the master branch. So you also make sure you just git clone using the GitHub URL. We saw with Flash, right, and redirect to, and we saw the difference between Flash and Flash.now, right? So if you're redirecting, it's going to reload the page, right? So with a redirect to command, you can say Flash. And the next time the page loads, which happens on the redirect, the Flash will show up. If you say Flash.now, it'll immediately show the Flash, right? But then what happens if you say Flash.now and then you call a redirect? You won't see, right? It'll really flash for a half nanosecond, right? And then it'll immediately redirect you. So if you're only going to call render, right, you say render new because there's some error. Render doesn't actually redirect you to a new page, and so you want to call then flash.now, right? And flash.now will actually go ahead and show the error. Some people had some issue with Bootstrap today. Bootstrap's always changing, but there's a fade CSS class that hid the flash. So if that happened, just inspect it. It's usually the fade or the show. Take a look at it and remove that, and you'll see the flash message. We also talked a little bit about forms today. So we had a form 4, right? And form 4 is a nice Rails helper. There's a lot that it does, and actually let's take a look at kind of some of the syntax of it. So we'll load up the API docs, and we'll look for form 4. Great, and so here we have our form 4, and it's what we typically use it as you pass in a model, and it's used to update the model or create a new instance of that model. And so we typically do it right in this use case. So form 4 with the model object, and we'll pass in some sort of object here, like a post or a person. If you want to have things named differently, it tells you kind of how to do that. If you, for whatever reason. And what's nice about a form 4 is it gives us access to the form as this block here, right? F. And so we can call then f.textfield, f.submit, and it knows how to relate our attributes back to the model. And that can be used for both updating or creating a new model. But there's a lot that it does underneath the hood. And so this is kind of a nice example here. It says form 4 post is essentially the same thing as right this whole line, where you're setting up the model as a post model, right? Your URL is the post path, right? And because we're either creating or updating, we expect an ID on that route, and so that's why we pass in the model again, right? The method here could be a patch if it's an update, or it could be a post if it's a new, as well as some HTML formatting, right? And so there's a lot you can change if you want to, but form 4 is nice because it kind of gives us all this automatically. The other thing we saw was a form tag, right? And we use this today with sessions because the sessions doesn't have an underlying model, right? There's nothing in the database that is a sessions model. So we can't say at sessions equals session.new because that doesn't really exist. So instead we use a form tag, and this is a generic helper for any sort of form that you want, right? The form could be, it's very customizable. You have to define the path. Luckily Rails has nice routes, and so you can use, you can define the path by at URL, or you can choose they don't have that example here, but you can choose just to pass in the path name, so you can say sessions path, right? And that's nice. You have to do a little more work, right? You kind of have to define the path, define the method. If it's a post, it's all right. If it's a different type of HTTP action, you got to define that as well. But just a good idea to always remember, there's a difference. They both have their use cases, and to kind of know the trade-offs and when to use one or the other. We also, again, right, we had user params, and if we didn't pass in password confirmation, it wouldn't even use it, right? And so if you only had it like this, it would just ignore the password confirmation. And so you actually had to make sure you included password confirmation to get passed into hash secure password. Right? But we've seen this before. We whitelist the attributes we want to see for security reasons. We also have a flash, right? We covered all this in the lecture last time as well, but you store the user ID in the session so that we know who they are on subsequent requests, right? And if they log in correctly, we want to redirect them because we want to a new route or new page. But if we're staying on with that same controller, right? We don't want to say redirect to new. We can just say go ahead and render a new, right? It's much more, it's faster. You don't have to reload the page. Great. And we also use a sessions controller to log in and also log out. And when we log out, we want to set the session user ID, right, to nil. We also added in some helper methods. So current user and also a signed in, which is essentially, the same thing as current user, right? You just check to see if there is a current user. That means they're signed in. You can also just check the session hash, right? Either way, but they're very identical. Also for RESTful routes, right? So we have resources sessions. We don't want to say also include destroy. Can anyone tell me why we don't want to say destroy here? Right? If we do that, what would the route look like? It would be a delete request, right? And it would be sessions, right? But then what else would it have? Exactly, ID, right? It would have an ID. It would look like that, right? And we don't really have a concept of a session ID because, again, the sessions is not a model. It's not a typical RESTful route. In a typical RESTful route, you'd pass up the ID of the object that you want to delete, right? But this, we actually want to log out. We don't really want to pass up an ID. So we don't want to include destroy. Instead, we kind of define it this way. So we say, let's call it just log out, and we'll route that URL to the action, sessions destroy. But then this way, it's not expecting an ID when it's passed up. All it's expecting is just a delete request to the route logout. Rather than, we can use the Rails helper, which is resources sessions. We also could just do it ourselves. We can, say get sign in, post sign in, or get sessions, and then map those to our actions. Just different ways of doing things, whichever one you prefer. But we make sure we don't want to have to pass up an ID with our destroy route. Milestone 4, we added flash messages. Like I mentioned, Bootstrap's always changing, so it doesn't show up. Inspect the HTML. We have to remove some CSS tags. But this one was pretty straightforward. And finally, if for those of you who got down here, we talked a little bit last time about the before action. So requiring the user to be logged in before they hit a certain page. And you can do an only, or you can do an accept, right? And so you can say, require them to this method, require user. And then we can define that. We could say something like, define require user. And then, unless current user.present, right? We could then route them to an action or something, or to be the style guide, right? If the user's not present, redirect to, or something like that, right? And so that's kind of a nice way to kind of enforce authentication on controllers, that users have to be able to log in to view certain things. One of the bonus milestones, if you're curious to play around with, was being able to see a limited view of a certain page. So if you're not logged in, you can still see some information, but not all of it. And so that would then require setting up a before action, but excluding that endpoint, and maybe within the context of that action, saying if they're logged in, show them this, otherwise show them that. There are other bonus milestones as well, so if you're curious, feel free to play around with them. One of them was adding in Facebook support. Starting with next week, we'll be using Devise for authentication, which is a gem that everyone used in the pre-work. The reason we kind of did do that this week is we want everyone to get experience creating authentication from scratch and really understand the process. So if you want to understand even further how authentication works with other services, you can try integrating with Facebook. Starting next week, though, we'll be using Devise, and Devise also has support for Facebook using a gem called OmniAuth Facebook. It's the same gem we used today, and so just another thing to play around with if you want to get more expertise. All right, let me cover now a few areas that came up, questions, hot spots. So let's just say I'm creating a new account and I try to sign up, and a lot of people hit this issue where they had nil is not a valid asset source, right? And essentially what it's trying to do is it's trying to show the image for the user, right, by asking for the image URL. But notice in our sign up form, right, there is no spot to pass an image URL. Right? We don't ask the user on this stage to upload an image, nor would we want to. That's not really kind of a good user experience. But when they sign up, we create a new user, and that user lacks an image URL. And so this part blows up. So what we could do, let me full size this. So it's defined here, right? User.try image URL. You could just very simply, you'd say unless user.image URL dot blank, right? And that essentially is saying skip this entire line if the user image URL is not defined. That works, but then that's kind of not great UI either, because now for some users there's just a big gap. There's no image, right? So we can probably do better than that. So what else can we do? Well, one idea is when you create a user, we say user.new user params. Before we call user.save, we could even say, user.image URL, and then pass in some default image, right? So we would say, all right, we'll create a user, we'll give it a default image for now, and then they can always go in and we can have some system for them to modify it. But remember last time we talked about keeping the controller very lean and very sparse, right? This starts to add more logic into the controller. And we don't really want to add in logic to the controller. We want to keep it as simple as possible. So we could do that, but that's not great. The preferred way to do it in Rails is we could define a function on the user model, right? We can say, give me the image. And we can say, if image URL.present, right? We can just say return image URL, right? Otherwise, we could have some sort of default URL, and let's just quickly grab like an image of something basic, like a ghost or something. We'll just say if you log in and you don't have a URL, we'll say you look like a ghost. All right, cool. Right? Cool. That is a good point. Yes. Let me get a better one. Thank you for that. We routed us to a. Just get a basic one. There we go. All right. So now if we refresh, so I still call it image URL. I'd have to here say image, right? And that would then call this function. Great. Now we have a bunch of ghosts. I could make this look nicer on the formatting side, but at least now we have images for every person. That's great, but you actually can take it even further. But at least this concept is clear, right? So we're kind of calling this method, and this method is returning to us if it exists or the backup. With Rails, there's a way to do this shorthand, so you actually can shorten this to be image URL.presence. And that's essentially the same code, right? So what it's doing is saying, is it present? If so, return it. Otherwise, return to us this default URL, and that's great. But we had to kind of rename this now from image to image, from image URL to image, and we kind of lost a little bit of the meaning because it's not an image; it's really a string which represents an image. So what if we wanted to keep the view the way it was, which is right image URL? Well, we actually could go ahead and overwrite the attribute, right? So the attribute on the model is image URL, which we can see here from the schema, right? But if we do this right now, this as is would throw an infinite loop because it would constantly keep calling itself and keep going over. So we actually can reference it that way. So you're actually referencing the image URL that's stored in the database. And if it's not there, then you're saying, all right, go ahead and give me the backup. That is conventional. You'll see this code actually on a lot of, yeah, you can overwrite the method so that the rest of the code doesn't need to know about it, but the model handles it. And again, some people don't prefer to do this because it starts to add a little complexity. So some people would prefer to keep, that function image there. But both of these, I'd say, are fairly conventional and pretty popular. You also, if you wanted to, you could, I believe, do read attribute, and that is a function, something like that. And if we refresh, right, still there. And so that's just kind of right. That's kind of the Rails way, is putting all that logic into the model to handle it. Great. The last thing I want to cover is we talked about this Rails coder dating, generate users, right? Where's that defined? So let's check out our code here, and we'll see here on the side, right, under the lib folder, coderdating.rake, right? And so namespace is coder dating, so that's how we can call Rails coder dating. Before Rails 5, you had to call it by rake, and there were some commands that were Rails and some that were rake, which is why it's still a rake file. But with Rails 5, they unified it all under the Rails namespace, so you can just call it by Rails, which is great. Here we have a task, right? So generate users, which we defined. This environment actually, it's kind of just part of Rails magic. If we didn't have that, it would just be a simple Ruby task. Actually, we'd call it that way, right? So we can define our own task, just task 1, and that would just be a simple Ruby task. But if we include the environment, then it loads the Rails environment in the context of this task, so we can start to create models or save models or manipulate the data, which is great. But you see there's a lot of code here. Essentially, what it's doing is it's creating some users based off some URL and saving them with the bang. But this is not quite great because now we have all this code. Instead, we might want to move it into here, into the user model, and define something like generate defaults, right? So we want to move it out of here, and then we can just call user.generate defaults, and throw it like that. Now, it's also going to be a class method, not an instance method, so we have to say self. Can anyone tell me why this might be a good idea? Please explain.
I don't like mixing testing code with production. So if you file like this, someone we call it production side.
You could.
So I would like to input this into database seed or whatever.
Yeah. You could also put a database seed, and that way it's only run in certain environments. You also could do this as a failsafe so it doesn't get run in production. Or maybe you want to run this in production. But the benefit of putting it in here versus in a rake file is it's hard to test in here, right? There really is no good mechanism for calling one of these functions and testing it. But if we put it all into our model, then there's a lot of great ways we can test our model. And so there's a lot of good code and ways that we can test it. If it's in rake file, it becomes hard to test. And we'll cover a lot more about testing next week. But just something to keep, I guess, look out for and stuff. you could put it in the rig file, but it's just hard to test and it becomes a little more complex. And yeah, cool. Does that all make sense? Um, so reminders: start the homework early. Who has not started the homework? Just a few honest souls. Everyone else is maybe lying. Please start the homework early. It's due Sunday night, and also start thinking about groups. So start to talk to each other. Maybe form some ideas. We'll talk more about the group project on Monday, but just start to think about ideas and people to work with. And all right, everyone, thanks, and we'll see you Monday.
I have one question.
Yeah.
Where's the convention place use for constants?
To constants. Um, I guess it depends. So you can put them in config initializers, right? You can define a whole bunch, all your initializers that you want here. So you could create a new initializer, right? And let's say we want to call it like users, right? Max num users, whatever, or something like that, right? That is one place I've seen them.
So how would you access this constant?
Um,
Control it.
so I believe you can access it directly. A lot of controllers also have them in it. It depends on the scope of the constant. Like if you need it just in the access of that file, or if you need it in throughout the app. Yeah.